The morning sun peeked through the blinds of the Riverside Police Department as Chief Sarah Thompson straightened her uniform in front of her office mirror. At 45 years old, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had earned every step of her journey. The golden badge on her chest caught the light, reminding her of the history she had made 6 months ago as the first black woman to lead this department. Sarah's dark hair was pulled back neatly, her brown eyes sharp and alert as they always were. 20 years of police work had taught her to notice everything, from the slight creak of her office door to the whispers that sometimes followed her through the hallways. Some of these whispers were proud, others less so, but Sarah had learned long ago not to let them affect her focus. Looking at the clock on her wall, she remembered that morning 20 years ago when she first walked into the police academy. She had been one of only 3 women in her class and the only black person. Many people had told her she wouldn't make it, but Sarah had proven them wrong, graduating at the top of her class. The journey from rookie officer to police chief hadn't been easy. She had worked every tough shift, handled the most difficult cases, and studied harder than anyone else. Each promotion brought new challenges. Some officers respected her achievements, while others questioned every decision she made. Now, as Chief Thompson walked through the station, officers greeted her with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Young Officer Rodriguez smiled broadly, proud to see someone who had broken through barriers leading the department. Sergeant Miller nodded respectfully, having worked with her on several cases over the years. But there were others, like Officer Barrett, who barely acknowledged her presence. In her first 6 months as chief, Sarah had already started making important changes. She created new training programs to help officers better understand the communities they served. She made sure complaints about officer behavior were properly investigated, not just filed away and forgotten. She also worked hard to hire more women and people of color, making the department look more like the city it protected. These changes weren't always popular. Just yesterday, she had overheard Officer Barrett complaining in the break room about how things were better in the old days. Sarah knew what he meant, but she also knew that those old days hadn't been better for everyone. Sitting down at her desk, Chief Thompson opened a thick folder containing reports from the past week. Coffee in hand, she began reviewing the numbers: crime rates, response times, community feedback. Her secretary had arranged everything perfectly, marking the most important items with yellow sticky notes. A knock on her door interrupted her work. "Come in," she called out, looking up to see Captain Rodriguez entering with more papers. "Morning, Chief," he said, placing a new report on her desk. "The community outreach program you started is showing some really good results. Complaints are down 15% since last month." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. This was exactly what she had hoped for when she started the program. "Thank you, Captain. Any challenges we should address?" "Well," Rodriguez hesitated, "some of the older officers are still resistant to the new sensitivity training requirements. Barrett's been particularly vocal about it." Chief Thompson nodded, having expected this resistance. "Change takes time, Captain. We'll keep moving forward, one step at a time." After Rodriguez left, Sarah stood up and walked to her window, looking out over the city she had sworn to protect. Riverside wasn't perfect, but it was changing. The old industrial buildings were being converted into community centers, new businesses were opening in once abandoned storefronts, and people from different backgrounds were working together to make things better. Her phone buzzed with a reminder about the upcoming department meeting. Sarah knew it would be challenging. She planned to announce several new initiatives that would push for even more accountability and community engagement. Some officers would support her, others would resist, but she was ready for whatever came her way. As she gathered her materials for the meeting, Chief Thompson caught her reflection in the window. She saw not just herself, but all the people who had supported her journey, her parents who had taught her to be strong, her mentors who had guided her, and even those who had doubted her, pushing her to work harder. She straightened her badge one more time and headed for the door. There was work to be done, and Sarah Thompson had never been one to back down from a challenge. The large conference room on the 3rd floor of the Riverside Police Department was filling up quickly. Officers filed in, carrying cups of coffee and chatting among themselves. Chief Sarah Thompson stood at the front of the room, arranging her presentation materials on the podium. The morning light streaming through the windows made her chief's badge gleam. Today's meeting was important. Sarah had prepared a detailed presentation about new diversity initiatives and community outreach programs. She knew not everyone would like what she had to say, but change was necessary for the department's future. Officer James Barrett walked in late, deliberately making noise as he pulled out a chair in the back row. He was a tall man with graying hair and cold blue eyes. His uniform always perfectly pressed despite his messy attitude. Several officers around him shifted uncomfortably, knowing his reputation for causing trouble. "Good morning, everyone," Chief Thompson began, her voice clear and professional. "Today we're going to discuss some new programs that will help us better serve our community." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing statistics about police interactions with different racial groups. Barrett's loud scoff echoed through the room. Sarah continued speaking, but she noticed how he whispered to the officers sitting near him, making them nervously glance between him and her. She had dealt with people like Barrett throughout her career, officers who couldn't accept change or take orders from someone different from them. As she explained the new training requirements, Barrett's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up. "This is ridiculous," he announced, interrupting her mid-sentence. "We don't need more sensitivity training. We need to focus on real police work." The room fell silent. Every eye moved between Barrett and Chief Thompson, waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah maintained her composure, remembering all the times she had handled similar situations. "Officer Barrett," she said calmly, "if you have concerns, we can discuss them professionally after the meeting. For now, please take your seat." But Barrett wasn't finished. His face had turned red with anger. "No, we need to discuss this now. You've been here 6 months, and you're trying to change everything that works. Just because you are." He stopped himself, but everyone knew what he had been about to say. Sarah looked him directly in the eyes. "Because I'm what, Officer Barrett? Please finish your thought." Her voice remained steady, but there was steel behind her words. Other officers in the room began to look uncomfortable. Sergeant Miller, a veteran officer who had worked with Sarah for years, spoke up. "James, sit down. You're out of line." Barrett ignored him. "Because you're not qualified for this position," he spat out. "Everyone knows you only got this job because of what you are, not who you are." A collective gasp went through the room. Captain Rodriguez started to stand up, but Chief Thompson raised her hand slightly, signaling him to wait. "Officer Barrett," she said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her authority, "this meeting is about making our department better at protecting and serving everyone in our community. If you can't participate professionally, you're dismissed." "You can't dismiss me," Barrett shouted, his fists clenched at his sides. "I've been here for 15 years. I've earned my place." "And I've been in law enforcement for 20 years, Sarah replied evenly. "I've earned my place too, Officer Barrett. Every step of the way. Now, for the last time, either sit down or leave the room." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Several officers had their hands near their phones, ready to record if things got worse. Barrett stood there, breathing heavily, his face getting redder by the second. Finally, he turned and stormed toward the door, knocking over his chair in the process. As he reached the doorway, he turned back. "This isn't over," he growled, loud enough for everyone to hear. Chief Thompson waited until he left, then calmly adjusted her papers. "Now, let's continue with the presentation. As I was saying, our new community engagement initiatives will focus on building trust and understanding." The meeting continued, but everyone could feel that something had changed. The line had been drawn, and Barrett had chosen his side. As Sarah moved through her slides, she could see officers whispering to each other, some nodding in agreement with her points, others looking worried about what would happen next. What no one knew was that Barrett hadn't gone far. He was waiting in the hallway, his anger building with each passing minute. The department meeting ended at exactly 10:30 a.m. As officers began filing out of the conference room, Chief Sarah Thompson gathered her presentation materials, taking her time to organize everything properly. She had noticed the tension in the room after Barrett's outburst and wanted to give everyone space to leave before she stepped into the hallway. Captain Rodriguez approached her podium, concern visible on his face. "Chief, would you like me to walk with you to your office?" Barrett didn't look right when he left. Sarah shook her head, giving him a reassuring smile. "Thank you, Captain, but I can handle myself. I dealt with officers like him before." She tucked her laptop under her arm, straightened her uniform, and headed for the door. The hallway seemed quieter than usual. The normal chatter and movement of a busy police station felt muted, as if everyone was holding their breath. As Sarah turned the corner toward her office, she saw him. Officer Barrett was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, waiting. Security cameras hung at both ends of the hallway, their red lights blinking steadily. A few officers lingered nearby, pretending to look at their phones or paperwork while watching the situation unfold. Sarah could have taken a different route to her office, but she refused to show fear or back down. As she approached, Barrett pushed himself off the wall. His face was still red with anger, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "You think you can embarrass me in front of everyone?" he growled, stepping into her path. Sarah stopped, maintaining a professional distance. Her voice remained calm and steady. "Officer Barrett, I suggest you take some time to cool down. We can discuss your concerns through proper channels once you're ready to have a professional conversation." Professional conversation? Barrett's voice rose with each word. "You want to talk about being professional? You've been destroying this department ever since you got here." He took a step closer, his finger pointing at her face. Two younger officers who had been standing nearby began to move forward, but Sarah raised her hand slightly, signaling them to stay back. She needed to handle this situation carefully. Any wrong move could make things worse. "Every single change you've made has been about race or diversity," Barrett continued, his voice echoing down the hallway. "What about real police work? What about the way things used to be?" Sarah met his angry gaze with a steady look. "The way things used to be wasn't working for everyone, Officer Barrett. Our job is to protect and serve the entire community, not just parts of it." "Community?" Barrett spat the word out like it was poison. "You don't know anything about this community. I was patrolling these streets while you were still in school." More officers had gathered at both ends of the hallway now, drawn by Barrett's shouting. Sarah could see Sergeant Miller on his radio, probably calling for backup. The security cameras continued their silent watch, recording everything. "You're right about one thing," Sarah replied, her voice firm but controlled. "I was in school, studying criminal justice, learning about modern policing techniques, preparing to serve my community. And I'd spent 20 years putting that knowledge to work, earning every promotion through hard work and dedication." Barrett's face twisted with rage. "Don't you dare lecture me about dedication. You got this job because you're a—" "Choose your next words very carefully, Officer Barrett," Sarah interrupted, her tone carrying a warning. "You're already facing disciplinary action for your behavior in the meeting. Don't make things worse for yourself." The hallway had gone completely silent. Everyone watched as Barrett stepped even closer to Chief Thompson, invading her personal space. His breath came in angry huffs, and sweat beaded on his forehead. "You think you can threaten me?" he snarled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think your fancy title makes you better than me? I got friends in the department, friends in the union. You can't touch me." Sarah stood her ground, neither backing away nor showing any sign of intimidation. "Step back, Officer Barrett. This is your final warning." Instead of stepping back, Barrett moved even closer. His next words came out in a hate-filled hiss. "You don't belong here. You never will, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." The tension in the hallway had reached a breaking point. Everyone could sense that something was about to happen, but no one could have predicted just how far Barrett was willing to go. Time seemed to slow down in that crowded hallway of the Riverside Police Department. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the security cameras continued their silent recording. Officer Barrett's face had turned an even darker shade of red, his body trembling with rage as he towered over Chief Sarah Thompson. Sarah could smell the coffee on Barrett's breath as he leaned in closer. Her years of training told her to be ready for anything. She noticed how his right hand was twitching, how his shoulders were tensing up. Around them, other officers watched with growing concern, many reaching for their phones to record what was happening. "I said step back, Officer Barrett," Sarah repeated, her voice steady and authoritative. She kept her hands visible at her sides, maintaining her professional composure even as the situation grew more dangerous. Barrett's eyes darted around the hallway, taking in all the witnesses. His mouth twisted into an ugly sneer. "Or what? You'll add me to your list of problem officers? You think you can change everything just because they gave you that badge?" This isn't about change anymore, Barrett, Sarah replied calmly. This is about your inability to follow basic orders from a superior officer. Something snapped in Barrett's eyes. Later, witnesses would describe it as the moment a dam broke. His face contorted with pure hatred, and before anyone could react, he did the unthinkable. His right hand shot up in a swift, violent motion, and with all his pent-up rage, he slapped Chief Thompson hard across the face. The sound echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. Several officers gasped. Someone shouted no. The slap was so forceful it turned Sarah's head to the side, her carefully styled hair coming slightly loose. For a split second, absolute silence fell over the hallway. Barrett stood there, his hands still raised, a look of shock spreading across his face as if he couldn't believe what he had just done. It was as if he thought his badge would somehow protect him from the consequences of assaulting the chief of police. Sarah slowly turned her head back to face him, her cheeks stunned from the impact, but her eyes were clear and focused. She hadn't moved from her spot, hadn't stumbled, hadn't shown any fear. Instead, a calm determination settled over her features. Barrett seemed frozen in place, his hands still suspended in the air. The reality of what he had just done was beginning to sink in. His eyes darted toward the exits, but he found both ends of the hallway blocked by shocked officers. I didn't mean. Barrett started to stammer, his voice suddenly uncertain. The aggressive confidence from moments ago had vanished, replaced by growing panic. Sarah reached up slowly and touched her cheek where he had struck her. The skin was hot and would likely bruise, but she showed no signs of pain or distress. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and fixed Barrett with a steady gaze that made him take a small step backward. The other officers in the hallway held their breath. Phones were recording everything. Sergeant Miller had his hand on his radio, waiting to see what would happen next. Captain Rodriguez had moved closer, ready to intervene if needed. Barrett's confidence continued to crumble as he looked around at his colleagues' faces. Where he might have expected to find support, he saw only shock and disgust. The weight of his actions was finally hitting him, and beads of sweat began forming on his forehead. You pushed me to this, he tried to justify, his voice weak and uncertain. You kept pushing and pushing with all these changes. Sarah remained absolutely still, her eyes locked on Barrett. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and carried throughout the entire hallway. Officer James Barrett. Barrett flinched at the sound of his full name. The authority in her voice made him instinctively stand straighter, years of police training kicking in despite his panic. The security cameras continued their silent recording as Chief Thompson prepared to speak again. In that moment, everyone present knew they were about to witness something they would never forget. Chief Sarah Thompson's voice cut through the tense silence of the hallway like a steel blade. Officer James Barrett, you are under arrest for assaulting a police officer. Her words were measured and clear, each one striking Barrett like a physical blow. The color drained from Barrett's face. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He stood there, frozen, as the reality of his situation crashed down around him. This wasn't how things were supposed to go in his mind. He had expected her to cry, to run away, to show weakness. Anything but this calm, professional response. Turn around and place your hands behind your back, Sarah commanded, her voice carrying the full weight of her authority. When Barrett didn't move, still frozen in shock, she repeated more firmly, I said, turn around, Officer Barrett. Don't make this worse than it already is. Captain Rodriguez and Sergeant Miller immediately moved forward, their training kicking in. Barrett's eyes darted between them, then back to Chief Thompson. His hands trembled as he slowly raised them. You can't do this, he stammered, but his voice had lost all its previous aggression. I'm a decorated officer. I have rights. Yes, you do have rights, Sarah replied calmly, touching her cheek where he had struck her. And I'll make sure they're read to you, just like any other person who assaults a police officer. She nodded to Rodriguez and Miller. Take him into custody. The two officers moved in, their movements precise and professional. Barrett's legs seemed to give out slightly as they took hold of his arms. The same man who had been so threatening just moments ago now looked small and afraid. Captain Rodriguez, please read Officer Barrett his rights, Sarah instructed, maintaining her composure. Around them, other officers watched in stunned silence as their colleague was turned to face the wall. Some were still recording on their phones, documenting everything. You have the right to remain silent, Rodriguez began, his voice steady as he secured the handcuffs around Barrett's wrists. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As Barrett's rights were being read, Sarah turned to address the gathered officers. I want statements from everyone who witnessed this incident. Officer Chen, please retrieve the security camera footage immediately. Officer Williams, contact Internal Affairs. This will be handled by the book, with complete transparency. The hallway burst into activity. Officers who had been frozen in shock now moved with purpose, some heading to write their statements, others securing the area. Barrett stood against the wall, handcuffed, as the full impact of his actions began to sink in. Chief, Sergeant Miller spoke up. Would you like to go to the hospital to have your injury documented? Sarah touched her cheek again, noting the heat and swelling. Yes, we'll do that. But first, I want to make sure everything here is handled properly. She turned to Barrett, who could barely meet her gaze. Officer Barrett, you'll be processed just like any other suspect. Captain Rodriguez will escort you to booking. As Rodriguez began leading Barrett away, the former officer finally found his voice again. My union rep. I want my union representative, he managed to say, his voice shaking. You'll have the opportunity to contact your representative, Sarah assured him, maintaining her professional demeanor. Every step of this process will be by the book. You'll receive the same rights and treatment as any other person in custody. No more, no less. Barrett's shoulders slumped as he was led away. The other officers parted to make way, many shaking their heads in disbelief. In just a few minutes, Barrett had thrown away 15 years of service, all because he couldn't accept taking orders from a black woman. Sarah watched them disappear around the corner, then turned to address the remaining officers. I know this is a difficult moment for our department, she began, her voice strong despite the visible mark on her face. But this is exactly why we need the changes we discussed in today's meeting. What happened here isn't just about one officer losing control, it's about the culture that made him think he could get away with it. The officers listened intently, many nodding in agreement. In that moment, they weren't seeing just their chief. They were seeing a leader who had just turned a crisis into a powerful lesson about accountability and justice. News of Officer Barrett's arrest spread through the Riverside Police Department like wildfire. By early afternoon, every officer, dispatcher, and staff member knew what had happened in that third-floor hallway. The security camera footage had been secured. Witness statements were being collected, and the incident report was being carefully prepared. Chief Sarah Thompson sat in her office, holding an ice pack to her cheek as she spoke with Internal Affairs investigators. The bruise was starting to show, a visible reminder of the morning's events. On her desk, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from other police chiefs, city officials, and news reporters. Walk us through it one more time, Chief, said Lieutenant Garcia from Internal Affairs, her pen ready to take notes. We want to make sure we have every detail correct. Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock at her door. Officer Chen entered with a USB drive in his hand. Chief, I have the security footage ready, he said, his face serious. All camera angles, with clear audio. It's pretty damning evidence. Sarah nodded. Thank you, Officer Chen. Please make 3 copies, one for Internal Affairs, one for the prosecutor's office, and one for our records. As Chen left, she turned back to Lieutenant Garcia. Where were we? Meanwhile, down in the department's break room, a group of officers gathered around Officer Rodriguez, who had just returned from processing Barrett's arrest. The room was buzzing with conversation. I can't believe he actually hit her, said Officer Williams, shaking her head. What was he thinking? Rodriguez set down his coffee cup. He wasn't thinking. That's the problem. 15 years on the force, thrown away in one moment of pure stupidity. Officer Miller, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. You know what's really getting to me? All the times we saw him acting out before and didn't say anything. The comments he made, the way he treated people, we all just looked the other way. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Many officers shifted in their seats, remembering times they had witnessed Barrett's inappropriate behavior, but stayed quiet. The guilt was visible on their faces. The silence was broken by Officer Jones, a veteran who had been with the department for 20 years. Well, that stops today, he said firmly. Chief Thompson's been trying to tell us this all along. We need to hold each other accountable. Back in the detective division, Detective Sarah Martinez was reviewing Barrett's personnel file. What she found was troubling. Multiple complaints about aggressive behavior, especially toward minorities and women, all either dismissed or buried in paperwork. She picked up her phone to call Chief Thompson. "Chief," Martinez said when Sarah answered, "I think you need to see this. Barrett's file, there's a pattern here that goes back years. And there are names of other officers who helped cover things up." Sarah's voice came through the phone, tired but determined. "Bring everything to my office, detective. Every complaint, every report, every name. It's time to clean house." In the department's lobby, reporters have begun to gather. The department's public information officer was trying to manage the situation, but word had gotten out. Local news vans were parked outside, their cameras focused on the building's entrance. Inside her office, Sarah finally put down the ice pack and stood up, walking to her window. She could see the media circus building outside. This story would be all over the news by evening. It would be a challenging time for the department, but maybe that's what they needed. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Officer Rodriguez. "Chief, you need to see this. Officers are coming forward. Not just about Barrett, about other problems too. They want to talk." Sarah read the message twice, feeling a mix of sadness and hope. The incident with Barrett had broken a dam of silence. Officers who had been afraid to speak up were finally finding their voices. Looking at her reflection in the window, Sarah could see the bruise darkening on her cheek. But she could also see something else, a department on the verge of real change. Sometimes it took a crisis to create an opportunity for transformation. She picked up her phone to reply to Rodriguez. "Set up a meeting. Let's hear what they have to say. It's time for everyone to be heard." 2 weeks had passed since Barrett's arrest, and the Riverside Police Department was going through the biggest transformation in its history. Chief Sarah Thompson sat at the head of the conference table, the same room where Barrett had first confronted her. The bruise on her cheek had faded, but the changes she had set in motion were only growing stronger. "Let's go over the numbers," Sarah said, looking at the officers gathered around the table. These weren't just any officers. They were the newly formed Internal Review Committee, a diverse group chosen by their peers to help reshape the department. Officer Rodriguez, now promoted to sergeant, pulled up the presentation on the screen. "In the past 2 weeks, we've received 47 reports from officers about past incidents of misconduct. 32 officers have come forward to give statements about problems they witnessed or were afraid to report before." Sarah nodded, making notes in her tablet. The atmosphere in the room was serious but hopeful. Officers who had once stayed silent were now speaking up, knowing they would be protected from retaliation. "What about the new training programs?" Sarah asked, turning to Officer Chen, who had become one of the most vocal supporters of change. Chen straightened in his chair. "The response has been amazing, Chief. We've had 98% participation in the voluntary bias training sessions. Officers are actually asking for more workshops. They want to learn. They want to do better." Around the table, heads nodded in agreement. The incident with Barrett had opened many eyes. Officers who had once resisted change were now some of its biggest supporters. In the hallway outside, the walls had been updated with new posters promoting community policing and inclusive practices. Where there had once been only old photos of former chiefs, all white men, there now hung a diverse array of images showing officers working with community members. "I have something else to share," Detective Martinez spoke up, sliding folders across the table. "We've completed the review of Barrett's old cases. We found 23 incidents where he used excessive force or showed clear bias. All of these cases are being reopened for review." Sarah took a deep breath. This was difficult but necessary work. "And what about the officers who covered for him?" 3 senior officers have been suspended pending investigation," Martinez replied. 2 others have resigned. The message is clear. The old way of protecting bad behavior is over. The meeting continued as they discussed new initiatives. Officer Williams, one of the younger officers, presented a plan for community outreach that had the whole room excited. "We're calling it Coffee with Cops," Williams explained. "Regular meetings in different neighborhoods where community members can talk with officers in a relaxed setting. Share concerns, build trust, get to know each other as people." Sarah smiled, remembering how just a few weeks ago, such a proposal would have been met with resistance. Now, officers were volunteering to participate. Later that afternoon, Sarah walked through the department, noting the changes. The break room, once a place where inappropriate jokes and comments went unchallenged, was now filled with officers having honest discussions about how to better serve their community. In the training room, a diverse group of officers was participating in a de-escalation workshop. Through the window, Sarah could see them practicing techniques, learning to handle difficult situations without force. Her phone buzzed with a message from the mayor. Community complaints down 40% since changes implemented. Keep up the good work, Chief. As she reached her office, Sarah passed the spot where Barrett had assaulted her. The memory was still fresh, but it no longer brought anger, only determination to continue the work of transformation. Inside her office, a stack of applications sat on her desk. Since the incident, there had been a surge of interest from diverse candidates wanting to join the force. People who had never considered a career in law enforcement were now seeing the department as a place where they could make a difference. Sarah picked up the top application, reading the personal statement. I want to be part of a police force that truly serves everyone in the community. Recent changes in the Riverside PD have shown me that real change is possible. Looking out her window at the city she served, Sarah felt a deep sense of pride. What Barrett had intended as an act of intimidation had instead become a catalyst for positive change. The department wasn't perfect yet, but they were moving in the right direction, one step at a time. 3 months after the incident, the Riverside County Courthouse was packed with spectators. Chief Sarah Thompson sat in the front row, her uniform crisp and perfect, watching as former Officer James Barrett stood before the judge. The security camera footage had been played during the trial, showing the assault from multiple angles. There was no room for doubt about what had happened that day. Barrett looked different now. His police uniform was replaced by a plain suit that seemed too big for him. His face, once red with anger, was now pale and tired. His lawyer stood beside him as the judge prepared to announce the verdict and sentence. Will the defendant please rise? The judge said, her voice firm and clear. Barrett stood slowly, his shoulders hunched. He couldn't bring himself to look at Chief Thompson or any of the other officers who had testified about his past behavior. James Barrett, the judge began, looking directly at him, this court has found you guilty of assaulting a police officer, a felony offense made more serious by the clear evidence that your actions were motivated by racial and gender bias. The courtroom was completely silent. Reporters in the back scribbled in their notebooks, while photographers captured Barrett's reaction to the verdict. Beyond the assault itself, the judge continued, this trial has revealed a disturbing pattern of misconduct throughout your career. Your actions have not only harmed individuals but have damaged public trust in law enforcement. Sarah watched as Barrett's hands gripped the table in front of him. She thought about all the people he had heard over the years, all the complaints that had been ignored, all the officers who had been afraid to speak up. The judge shuffled her papers and delivered the sentence. This court sentences you to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are permanently banned from serving in any law enforcement capacity. Additionally, you will complete 500 hours of community service working with organizations that serve minority communities. As Barrett was led away by court officers, Sarah stood and walked out of the courtroom. Outside, reporters gathered around her, microphones extended. Chief Thompson, how do you feel about the verdict? One reporter asked. Sarah straightened her badge before responding. Today isn't just about one person or one incident. It's about setting a standard. No one is above the law, especially those sworn to uphold it. Back at the police department that afternoon, Sarah called a meeting with all officers. The large conference room was filled to capacity, with officers standing along the walls. The mood was different from that day 3 months ago. There was a sense of unity and purpose that hadn't existed before. The verdict today sends a clear message, Sarah began, looking around the room, that the real victory isn't what happened in court. It's what's happening right here, in our department. She clicked through slides showing the department's progress. Complaints against officers down by 60%, community trust ratings up by 45%, applications from minority candidates increased by 80%, the number of incidents resolved without force up by 70%. These numbers tell a story, Sarah continued, but the real story is in the changes I see every day. Officers intervening when they see something wrong. Community members stopping by to thank us for our service. Young people who once feared the police now asking how they can join the force. Officer Rodriguez raised his hand. Chief, the community basketball program we started last month? We got 15 more officers who want to volunteer. Sarah smiled. This was the kind of change she had dreamed of when she first became chief. That's excellent, Rodriguez. And how's the mentorship program going? 32 officers paired with local high school students, Officer Chen reported proudly. We've got a waiting list of kids who want to join. As the meeting continued, Sarah thought about how far they'd come. Barrett's attack, meant to intimidate and destroy, had instead become the catalyst for real transformation. Later that evening, as Sarah prepared to leave her office, she paused to look at a new photo on her wall. It showed her officers at a recent community event, playing with local kids, talking with parents, building the trust that had been broken for so long. Her phone buzzed with a message from the mayor. Just saw the news about Barrett's sentencing. But the real news is how you've transformed the department. You've shown everyone what real leadership looks like. Sarah picked up her jacket and turned off her office light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but now they faced them as a united department, committed to justice and equality for all. Barrett had tried to hold on to the past, but instead he had helped create a better future.